morning, everybody. On behalf of Governor Cuomo, I want to, first of all, wish you a good morning and welcome you to the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. In just a few moments, you will hear from Governor Cuomo, HUD Secretary Shaun Donovan, Undersecretary Polly Trottenberg from the U.S. Department of Transportation, MTA Chairman and CEO Tom Prendergast, and Executive Director of the Port Authority of New York, Pat Foye, and New Jersey. But first, I want to direct your attention to a video, to screens, to watch a very special video presentation.
And the power of Mother Nature and how it can rise up from nowhere. It could be a totally fine day one day, and the next day all hell breaks loose. And you had a little stream, a little creek in the backyard, and it becomes a raging monster. And then the damage that water can do. You know, when the pictures don't do it justice. You see a picture of a flood, the next day the water's gone. It looks basically okay. Now, water brings a toxic mix, mold, it brings a filth, it brings a mud, a dirt that is devastating to the communities that it hits. I was in Margaretville when the water was probably at its highest. Literally, the water was coming over the hood of the truck. It was that high and it was that fast, and it came out of nowhere. I mean, it's just a phenomenal deluge, and it was amazing how quickly things can go from seemingly fine to devastating and dangerous like that. Literally within minutes. Literally within minutes. No warning, nothing.
Every year we've had a storm. When we first moved in, we had a nor'easter, and everybody was like, "Oh, we haven't had a storm like that in 20 years." And then last year was Irene, and now this.
Yeah, that's right. Every year is the first storm. We have once in 100-year storms every year now. There is a different pattern to the weather that is undeniable. Life says things are going to happen that are going to come along and knock you on your rear end. When you least expect it, through no cause of your own, something's going to happen. And the question is, how do you respond? Do you get up? Do you learn from it? And are you the better for it? Who should decide if you should be putting in a water sewage treatment plant or storm sewers or buying out houses? You should decide. Middleburg should decide. Schoharie should decide. Esperance should decide. Because you know best.
My neighbor Eve in the black jacket lives across the street. Her house is condemned. She's finding pictures of hers all over my property because her garage was just moved and slammed into the side of the house.
This we can read though.
Thank you.
The goal is to build back better than before. Not to replace what was, but to replace it smarter, leaner, more efficient, more effective, better than before. You saw first responders in this community who were magnificent. You saw neighbors helping neighbors that were inspirational. I saw neighbors come out and help other people dig mud out of their basement who were in the same situation in their home, but they wanted to be there to help their neighbors. I saw volunteers come up from all across the state to your community on Labor Day, and it was a beautiful thing to see. We're New Yorkers, we're tough. We're also a loving, caring, community-oriented people. You have to dig deep and remember who you are. Remember, we are New Yorkers at the end of the day. Remember the blood that's in your veins. You knock us down, we get up twice as strong, twice as ready. That's the story of New York.
I'm very pleased to welcome some very special guests this morning. First of all, we're very proud to have the HUD Secretary Shaun Donovan with us. Governor Andrew Cuomo. Polly Trottenberg is the Undersecretary for Policy for U.S. Department of Transportation. Howard Glazer, our Director of State Operations. Tom Prendergast, who is the Chairman and CEO of the MTA. Patrick Foye, our Executive Director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Cesar Perella is our Secretary of State. Commissioner Darrell Towns of NYHCR. Jerome Hauer, who is our Commissioner of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. Joan McDonald, our Commissioner of Department of Transportation. Rose Harvey, our Commissioner of New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Jeremy Creelin, who is our Special Counsel to the Governor. Seth Diamond, our State Director of Storm Recovery. J.B. Rubin, who's our Director of the New York Rising Program. Richard Kaufman, our Chair of the Energy and Finance. And Gil Canones, who is our President and CEO of NYPA. As many of you know, today marks the one-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, one of the worst natural disasters New York City and Long Island has ever faced. Although Hurricane Sandy passed through New York City in a matter of hours, the loss and damage that she left behind in her wake was devastating, and we're still feeling the effects of that storm even today. Houses are being rebuilt, subway lines are still reopening, and roads are still being repaved. However, instead of accepting our fate and merely trying to build back what was before, New York State has taken unprecedented steps toward building back better and stronger. After Sandy, the governor went to Washington, D.C. to fight for storm funding from Congress, and he succeeded. He created 3 commissions: New York State Ready, New York State Respond, and New York State 2100, and established New York Rising Communities, all charged with improving the way we prepare for and respond to natural disasters, as well as solidifying our infrastructure to withstand major weather incidents in the future. Last week, the MTA and the Empire State Development launched a tourism campaign specifically aimed at driving New Yorkers and out-of-state visitors to the Sandy-impacted areas so we can help those communities get back on their feet financially. And yesterday, we held a conference in Albany focused entirely on emergency preparedness. We were joined by hundreds of law enforcement officials, first responders, and emergency managers from throughout New York State, whose goals are saving lives and protecting property and the environment during emergencies and disasters. Today, we'll get the opportunity to see some of the improvements that have been completed since last year. From here, we'll go to the new South Ferry subway station to see a demonstration of a flood mitigation procedure, and then on to Ground Zero, where we'll see the progress that's been made by the Port Authority in protecting one of our national sites. And finally, the tour will end at LaGuardia Airport, where we'll tour the site of the new substation. This is the culmination of months of tireless work and dedication by the governor and his team, of which I'm very proud to be a part of. The swift and decisive action he took before and after the storm set the tone for our state and those around us. I also want to say, if I could, in looking at that last year, the governor often says that in the worst of circumstances, you see the best come out in people. He says that repeatedly. We saw the best come out in New York State. We saw the best come out in our governor. And I'm very proud to say that throughout these storms, this man has been boots on the ground, out front, leading from the front. I've never seen that in my career, where he has pulled people together, he has made things happen, he has taken a bureaucracy, pulled it, and sometimes kicked it square in the butt, but he has done everything he could to make sure that things happen for the people of the state. He is a great leader. He is one that made us all proud. And please welcome the great governor, the great state of New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and I want to thank the Lieutenant Governor for his extraordinary work over this past year, and it's representative of the efforts of the entire team. I'd also like to thank the National Museum for the American Indian for hosting today. This is an amazing facility. If you get any time after this event, it really is worth walking through. Today is the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, as everyone knows, and as you heard from the Lieutenant Governor, we're going to take this opportunity to look at the progress we've made since and discuss some of the lessons that we've learned. I think it's important today that we remember the lives that were lost a year ago today. the families that were displaced, the amount of personal anguish that families went through all throughout the New York State region. I also want to begin by remembering the tremendous effort of the first responders, which you want to talk about courage and skill and dedication. But for the first responders, the damage would have been much, much worse, and we would have lost more lives. So let's give them a round of applause, all the first responders. I also want to thank the state team as well as the officials from city government and the local governments. It's been a year. It's not an exaggeration to say people have been working literally every day for the past year to accomplish what we've accomplished thus far. Over $10 billion, over 3,000 projects are completed or underway in a year, which is, I believe, a tremendous accomplishment to get that many governments, to get that much bureaucracy to move during that period of time. As the Lieutenant Governor said, sometimes it's the special state program of a kick square in the butt, but it's really been remarkable progress over the past year, and I want to applaud all of them. It's also fitting that we're in Lower Manhattan today to have this discussion. When New Yorkers say Lower Manhattan, New Yorkers tend to be a literal people. Lower Manhattan, not just because it's the southern tip of Manhattan, but because it's lower than most of Manhattan. And therefore, during Hurricane Sandy, the largest amount of damage was done here in Lower Manhattan. The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which you saw in the video and which was filled by Hurricane Sandy and was one of the really illustrative visions of that night, is just a few blocks from here. Ground Zero is just a few blocks from here, which also sustained a significant amount of damage. And literally, this point right here, this building was flooded, and literally the Hudson River and the East River just rose and came over Lower Manhattan. And that night, the only question was when the tide crested, because Mother Nature was going to do whatever Mother Nature wanted to do that night. And it was clear, and there was a feeling of powerlessness, frankly, for me, that I had probably never felt in my life. And it was a traumatic, frightening event, but one that we're recovering from, and one that we want to learn from. The theme we've been using on the state side is build back better, build back better. First, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to be the better for the experience, but also let's learn from the experience. I do not believe that this is the last time we're going to go through this. There won't be another Hurricane Sandy, but I believe there will be another name. I believe there will be another extreme weather event that creates tremendous damage and challenges for this state, for states all across the nation. And we have to take this opportunity to really learn from it and go forward. The state runs the large systems in the state, right? As a state government, what does the state do versus the localities? We run the systems. We run the transportation system. We run the energy system, the subway system, the bus system. So we're really taking the opportunity to improve those systems from what we went through. And in rebuilding, reimagining those systems through the prism of extreme weather. And how would you build it differently, and what precautions would you take? You'll hear from Tom Prendergast, who has done a magnificent job at the MTA, both before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm. People talk about the magic of Manhattan and how high we build in Manhattan, the skyscrapers of Manhattan. That's true. The real engineering marvel of Manhattan is how deep we build. Manhattan can go down 10 stories, 15 stories. Subway systems, water tunnels, all underground. Well, that poses a challenge when you talk about possible floods, because you can't allow that infrastructure underground to flood. So one of the big challenges for the MTA, the subway system, is how do you seal that system? How do you seal those tunnels so water doesn't penetrate? The amount of repair that the MTA is doing is massive. It's the largest construction program since the system was built. Salt water and electricity is a bad combination. While the MTA was brilliant in how quickly it came back online, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a tremendous amount of damage that went on. So between the repair and the reconstruction, the MTA and the subway system and the bus system has been doing remarkable work. We learned a lot of lessons about our energy system. First, we learned how de minimis the role of government is when it came to dealing with the utilities in the middle of the emergency. It was up to the utilities. And government has a regulatory role, but we had no active intervention in the midst of the emergency. It was just up to the utilities to make the decisions about what courses of activity they were undertaking. We've changed that. The state now regulates through an entity called the PSC, and we have more authority in situations like that. Long Island had a significant problem with power outages and a long delay in the power coming back by an agency called LIPA, Long Island Power Authority. LIPA basically no longer exists. They've basically been replaced, and the delay during the storm was the catalyst for their replacement. They've been replaced by another utility company. We learned the hard way that we have a fuel system in this state that is very delicate and fragile. And during the storm, the harbor was closed, and that caused a backup in the fuel delivery, which caused weeks of trauma in the system. We never had before a strategic fuel reserve. We do now. We had gasoline stations that had gas in their tanks, but they couldn't pump it because there was no power. All these things that you wouldn't have thought of, frankly, until you went through it. So we now have a new fuel system capacity. We have generators on gas stations, on major evacuation routes. But we had to redesign our fuel system. Airports you'll hear about, same thing. You can't allow an airport to flood. You can't allow an airport to lose power. You lose power on an airport, the airport shuts down. We learned that the hard way. And we've also been working with the individual communities from a community development point of view, where we took a novel approach. And rather than the government telling the communities what to do, we said to the communities, why don't you tell us what you think you need? Why don't you come together as a community, organize, have a discussion, come up with a plan, and we'll fund that community, we'll empower that community. What you have to remember about New York is a collection of neighborhoods. It's an assemblage of neighborhoods. Staten Island is one neighborhood. Rockaway is a little different. Breezy Point is a little different. Same out on the island, going out on Long Island. And respecting the individuality of those communities and the personality and the character of those communities, which suggested to us, ask rather than tell, and let them come up with their own vision for revitalization. And that has worked very well. Even the exercise of them coming together and talking about the future, I think, was very healthy. And we've also spent a lot of time on redesigning and improving the first responder network. This was a different situation. And the first responder network that we have in this state, frankly, was not equipped for it. It wasn't designed for it. We've started 2 institutes where we have an academic component. We're going to have training protocols. So we're going to make sure next time we'll be much better prepared from a first responder point of view. In sum, a year later, the expression, it takes a crisis. Sometimes it takes a crisis for society to appreciate a new reality. And I think the crisis of Hurricane Sandy, which in this state, when you put together with Storm Irene and Storm Lee, which were about 2 years ago, but over the past 3 years, about 70% of the state has undergone some extreme weather condition. And we get we learned the lesson the hard way, but we get that there is something different going on, that there is an extreme weather situation with frequency, that there is a new normal, and we get that we have to redesign and we have to be prepared in a different way, and we should expect this. And maybe it took that crisis to impress that upon us. A few blocks from here, we had a tremendous crisis at 9/11, which taught society a lesson about terrorism and vulnerability to terrorism. Well, we learned a lesson about vulnerability to extreme weather during Hurricane Sandy. It is what New York is all about. You look at how we developed this city and this state. We learn from these crises, and we do grow stronger. 1835, we had a fire in New York City. That's what prompted the aqueduct system, the Croton system, 41 miles of aqueducts from the 1835 fire. Hudson River froze 1 year, prompted us to build the Holland Tunnel so we could always have coal and goods coming into Manhattan. We learn from the crises, and we will learn from this crisis. And the point in the video is true. You know, people talk about New York, and they talk about how tough New Yorkers can be and how gruff they can be, and that's part of our persona, to live in a place as dense as we have here in New York. Maybe you have to develop some thick skin once in a while. But when you need a sense of community and when you need people to rise to the occasion, no one is better than New Yorkers. And we saw that in volumes during this crisis. The giving, the generosity, the selflessness was so inspirational and really gave people the strength they needed to go on. So let's not forget that as we reflect back on this anniversary. I thank you all very much for taking the time to be with us and to come out to share these experiences. It is a learning and growing experience, and I'm sure we'll have more to do. But the past year, we've made great progress. We have a number of people to thank for that progress. I'm very proud of the way the state has operated and the city government and the local governments, county executive of Nassau, county executive of Suffolk. But the federal government has been a great partner to us. The supplemental appropriation that was passed, which is about $60 billion for the entire storm. New York will be just over 50% of that, so it's about $30 billion to the state of New York. That is a lot of money. It's the amount we needed, but it's also a tremendous amount of resources that has allowed us to do what we've done over the past year. None of it would have been possible without the resources. And the resources came from the federal government. And it's funny in life sometimes how things work. The HUD secretary, who I'm going to have the pleasure to introduce in a moment, Shaun Donovan. HUD is now at the center of the reconstruction efforts. President Obama named Shaun Donovan the head of the reconstruction efforts, and HUD itself, by design, is the agency that's at the point of reconstruction. Shaun Donovan, I worked with at HUD during the Clinton years. We worked together, so I knew Shaun very well, and we had experience with each other. Shaun left HUD, when we all left HUD, came and was New York City Housing Commissioner. So he knew New York City, he knew the state of New York, I knew Shaun, Shaun knew how New Yorkers operate and how New York City operated, which if I had to explain that to a new HUD secretary, I would still be explaining the nuances of how New York City and New York State worked. But that was one of the silver linings, was the relationship that we had and the knowledge that this HUD secretary had of this city and this state. And we could not have done what we accomplished if it was not for HUD Secretary Shaun Donovan and the tremendous effort by his team. And I want to publicly thank him for that today. And with that, let me introduce HUD Secretary Shaun Donovan.
Governor Cuomo, Andrew, thank you for the warm introduction. Much more importantly, thank you for your leadership over this past year. Andrew said it maybe a little more modestly than I would. I worked for him at HUD, and I got to witness up close what it means to be a leader. And what I will tell you, after 4.5 years in this job, having traveled the country and seen too many communities devastated by floods, by tornadoes, by wildfires, by hurricanes, that there is no moment when leadership is tested more than in a disaster like this. And frankly, some leaders crumble under the pressure. Not Andrew Cuomo. It has been a great source of comfort to me, a great source of inspiration to watch his leadership over the past year. And Andrew, I just want to say thank you, not only as a federal official and your partner in this rebuilding, but also as a lifelong New Yorker and a friend. Thank you for what you have done to lead this great state over the past year. You have built a remarkable team here. So many of them are here, and some of them even stolen from my team, I would add. Borrowed. But they have done remarkable work, and I look forward to seeing some of that progress today. I also want to thank my partner and colleague, Polly Trottenberg. No part of this region was hit harder than our transportation infrastructure. And obviously, one of the great heroic stories of this recovery was the leadership of the state agencies over the transportation system. Part of that is because we have an enormously talented group at the Department of Transportation that are absolutely committed to make sure that we not just build back, but build back stronger and smarter. And really, we're going to see that today on the tour. I also want to say a word, not just as a federal official, but as a lifelong New Yorker. The events of a year ago affected me deeply in a personal way. I have a close friend who lost his daughter in Brooklyn, many friends and neighbors who lost their homes and businesses. And I know that for every story I have as a New Yorker, there are thousands, if not millions, of those stories. Even a year removed from this terrible storm, the pain and the memories are still deep. And it is not just that emotional trauma that folks face. The economic pain to this region was absolutely unthinkable to so many of us. 200,000 small businesses closed due to damage, 650,000 homes damaged or destroyed, 2 million working days lost, and 9 million customers without power, far more than in Katrina. And what these terrible statistics tell is that Sandy was easily one of the worst natural disasters this country has ever seen. But while Sandy was strong, New Yorkers are stronger. And that is what we have seen. That is the best and most important story of this past year, is to see the recovery. As Andrew said, we are fighters, and we will come back every time we get knocked down like this. And I want to just make sure that everyone hears loud and clear as we continue to recover that this president, the entire federal government, believes that this region's best days are ahead of it, not behind it, and we are going to ensure that, working closely with the governor and his entire team. Now, as the governor said, I was honored to be named by the president to lead the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, and obviously, one of our most important jobs is to get resources to this community, to this region as quickly as possible. 1 year removed from the storm, we've provided assistance to over 230,000 families and small businesses. We've made almost $40 billion available to communities, to families, to our state partners. And if you'd asked me a year ago, when I saw the terrible destruction, whether we would have seen the extent of recovery that we've seen this far, if you'd asked me whether 97% of the region's beaches would be open for Memorial Day, I wouldn't have believed it. We have made great progress. But there is much left to do. And one of the most important tools that we have is the Community Development Block Grant funding. Governor Cuomo said it from the very beginning. We have to make sure that this money is flexible so that his vision of making sure that local communities can decide what they want their communities to be, how they should recover, is served by these federal resources. And so the single largest allocation in this federal supplemental was the Community Development Block Grant Program at HUD. And yesterday, I was pleased to be able to make about $5 billion more of that funding available, including the largest grant to the state of New York, just over $2 billion. That brings to a total of almost $4 billion available to the state of New York to help rebuild in a very flexible way. Now, one of the things beyond that federal checkbook that we can bring is to help make sure that there is coordination on a regional basis. It's one of the things that the president asked me to do when he created the task force. And why is this important? Well, there are things that the state of New York can do to make sure that gas is flowing the next time we have an emergency. But most of the terminals that bring gas into this region are in New Jersey. There must be regional coordination to make sure that work is done. Governor and I were just talking before we started about the Battery Tunnel and how the work that we're going to do to protect the tunnel is also going to have implications for the surrounding buildings. If water doesn't go into the tunnel, it's going to go somewhere. We have to make sure that we're thinking in a comprehensive way about protecting this area. The same is true of our region. If we protect the New York side of New York Harbor, New Jersey will get more water. And so we have to think in a coordinated regional way about how these projects work. And one of the things I'm most excited about is the way that the projects that we're going to see today, the work that's being done in the Port Authority and with the leadership of our task force, is really thinking comprehensively about the challenges that we have. And most importantly, we are thinking about not just the storm that may come next year, but what is happening in the long term. Because the truth is, as the president said so eloquently in his second inaugural address, one of the great challenges for all of us as Americans is that we protect our children and their children from the change that our climate is experiencing. It's no coincidence that the 12 warmest years in our history have come in the last 15 years. It's no coincidence that, as the governor likes to say, seems like that 100-year storm is coming every year now. So we must build differently. We must build smarter. And there are those critics who would say, you know, that's right, but we can't afford it. Our fiscal situation is too difficult. Well, I would say we can't afford not to build smarter. For every dollar that we invest in the kind of projects that you're seeing today, we save $4 the next time a storm hits. We must build differently. And I am so admiring of the work that the governor and his team have done to do exactly that, to build for a future that will be different, and to make sure that an anniversary like this of whatever storm may come next, we won't have to remember the more than 100 people who were killed. We won't have to remember the terrible damage that was done by Sandy, because we will be better prepared the next time a storm comes. Thank you, Governor, for all your work. Thank you for your partnership.
Very nice. Very nice.
On behalf of Governor Cuomo and all of us, I want to thank Secretary Donovan for taking time out of his very, very busy schedule to join us today. We thank him. And next, we're very pleased to be joined by Undersecretary Polly Trottenberg from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Polly?
Thank you. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Duffy and Governor Cuomo. Thanks for having me here today on behalf of Secretary Fox and USDOT to commemorate the anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. I want to thank all of you for your leadership and so many others in this room and throughout the region. As Secretary Donovan said, I think the leadership that was shown in New York is truly remarkable. And I think I'm very proud of the Obama administration and USDOT's partnership working with you all. I want to echo something Secretary Donovan said and Lieutenant Governor Duffy. The governor has been relentless here in New York. He's also been relentless in Washington. He and his team have worked very, very closely with us at DOT and all the federal agencies to ensure that New York has gotten everything it needs from us at the federal level. So he has been a real champion for you down in Washington as well. Secretary Fox was able to visit this region last week, and I want to repeat something that he said during his visit. He said DOT remains absolutely committed to helping this city, this state, and this region come back stronger than ever. We were with you when Sandy made landfall. We were able to work actually closely with Secretary Donovan and the Sandy Task Force to make sure that we could cut red tape and ensure the delivery of fuel and supplies. FAA personnel has worked around the clock to get the airports up and running. And of course, we were able, working with some of the leaders at this table and the congressional delegation, to get the funds from the Disaster Relief Appropriations Act to speed hundreds of millions of dollars to start repairing roadways, bridges, tunnels, seawalls, and transit systems. And I, too, want to recognize the leadership of some of the folks we have sitting at this table and the frontline workers who toiled around the clock in difficult conditions to get the region's subway systems up and running faster than anyone expected. It really was an extraordinary feat for Tom and Pat, so thank you. Looking ahead, we also share the governor's commitment to helping storm-ravaged communities of New York recover as quickly as possible and become more resilient. So far, we've obligated over $1 billion to support recovery and resiliency projects in the region. And going forward, we'll continue to provide federal aid as the MTA and the Port Authority and other agencies come in for reimbursement for all the work that they're doing. We will also be allocating billions of more to resiliency projects that protect critical transportation and infrastructure, so taxpayers won't have to pay to restore the same transit services a second and third time. We will be with you in the future as you finish the job and build a system that is stronger and better able to withstand future storms. I like the governor's phrase, build back better. That's the kind of partnership we would like to have with all of you here in New York. So thank you very much. I'm glad to be here today.
Thank you, Polly, and also thank you for taking the time to be with us. Next, I want to turn over to Chairman and CEO of the MTA, Tom Prendergast. Tom?
Thank you very much. I'd like to quickly go through an overview of what Hurricane Sandy was to us, what we did to respond, and more importantly, what we need to do going forward to make the system that much more resilient. This is what Hurricane Sandy looked like from a satellite photograph. To say a storm of 1,000 miles in width is foreboding. The fact that it was also the storm that had the lowest barometric pressure this far north of the equator. I remember hearing that statement when I was in the control center, and that caused me a great deal of concern, because directly related to drops in barometric pressure and high wind speed are storm surges, which is what we saw. This is what Lower Manhattan looked like to Sandy. This is from a slosh map, a sea, lake, and overland surge from hurricanes map. And what you show here is what you can't fool Mother Nature. That which we've added to the lower tip of Manhattan is where the water came back, and it came back in severe form. The targets it had were the some 540 openings that the subway system has. As the governor stated, it's a remarkable feat of engineering to be underground, but it provides many challenges for us in terms of what we need to do to waterproof the system. And each one of these areas, especially as water builds in height and has pressure, will be entry points for water into the system. The disaster plan we had and the decision the governor took to close the entire network down is what really helped save the damage to the system. For those assets that are mobile, like the rolling stock, the buses, the rail cars, and the subway cars, we can locate them to other areas of safe haven, underground, higher ground, and keep them. We did not lose a single vehicle in our entire fleet, which was a major accomplishment. But we cannot move the other aspects of the infrastructure, the power, the signals, the communication, and fire and life safety systems that provide transport protection for those movements underground. We rebounded fairly quickly. We got bus service back the next day. We put the Marines on the ground with the buses and started getting people back to work. There are 8.5 million people that use our system. We generate and power a $1.4 trillion economy, second only to Tokyo, and it was essential that we get that transportation system back up and running as soon as possible. Make no mistake about it, the damage that this system saw was the greatest it had ever seen in its entire history. What this map shows are the catastrophic losses that we saw across the entire network, whether it be New York City Transit, Long Island Railroad, Metro North, or bridges and tunnels. New York City Transit alone has $750 billion of assets. The entire MTA family, over $1 trillion. And while we have had other storms that affected parts of the system, never before had we had a storm that affected this number of elements of the system. The damage was catastrophic, as these pictures show. As the governor stated, salt water and electrical components do not go together. They do not go together at all, not only in terms of when they're there, but as the water recedes, it leaves latent failures waiting to occur. This picture of Beach 86th Street at the top center is not a gondola ride. That's our subway station at Beach 86th Street in Brooklyn. The Queens Midtown Tunnel, the UL Carey Tunnel, very large tunnel bores, some 25 feet in diameter as compared to 14 feet for a subway tunnel, with extremely critical fire and life safety communication equipment in the tunnels, all had to be dealt with. Through the efforts of the governor and the local delegation and the people that worked to get the Sandy recovery money, to some $60 billion overall, but $10 billion for transit, we needed to do something that was different. We needed to be able to not have processes control us, but we control processes. So we dedicated some 200 people solely to dealing with Sandy issues, rather than dealing with the other issues they do in terms of engineering and operation of the subway system. We took advantage of executive orders issued by the governor so that we could streamline the procurement process, and we made sure that we got outside the box in terms of how we were going to procure some of this. And one of the more difficult decisions was, how were we going to do work in the most damaged under-river tube, the Montague Street tube, which is almost underneath us here at this point. And if we did it traditional way on night and weekend closures, it would take 4 years to get done. But if we did it with a closure and supported the loss of transportation of that element of the network with other pieces, we could get it done in 14 months, and we're committed to do it in 14 months, if not sooner. It's important we get this work behind us. In the 90 days following Sandy, we committed and spent some $206 million getting the most vital elements of the system back up and running. We transported cars on flatbeds out to the Rockaways to restore service there, put in a bus shuttle. We started to pump the under-river tunnels dry with the pump trains we had, and clean debris off the right-of-way of the entire system. And these are examples of some of the expenditures by agency. In terms of New York City Transit, as I said, we put that bus and train shuttle service out in the Rockaways because they truly were isolated from the rest of the city without the main transportation element available to them. We cleaned up South Ferry, and we began work on the two most seriously damaged under-river tubes. In terms of Long Island Railroad, there was severe damage out in the Long Beach branch, and it took over a month to get that service restored, as well as clear up areas where we have storage of equipment. There's one thing you can assume. Any transportation element where you store trains is generally no other real estate use available, and so that's why we got it, but they're generally low-lying areas that flood. The same was true for Metro North because, as you know, most people, maybe you don't know, but the Hudson River is the tidal estuary, and so it was severely affected, as was the Metro North right-of-way during the storm. I think the work bridges and tunnels did was absolutely phenomenal. They, in their two under-river tunnels that provided vehicular access to and from Manhattan and Queens and Manhattan and Brooklyn, saw large amounts of water that they had to pump out. And they had to pump it out very judiciously because you have a hung tunnel and hung tunnel ceiling, and you need to make sure that you pump that water out in a way that you don't leave water that the ceiling has to carry. You'll bring the ceiling down. You also have to restore critical fire and life safety systems before traffic can be restarted. For those of you that saw what happened to traffic in Brooklyn and Staten Island with the UL Cary Tunnel out, you know what the importance of that transportation element is. Any single link in our transportation structure, network, if it's out, impacts the region at large. This is an unprecedented, as the governor said, amount of work that we have to do. Never in the 110-year history of the New York City subway system have we seen the needs of work that we have to do. Some $4.7 billion in recovery, restoring the system to the way it was the day before the storm, and almost $5 billion in resiliency, hardening it to the point that should another storm come our way, we will be prepared for it. Today, as we speak, those of you don't know, there's a tremendous storm in Western Europe, and it's affecting London, and it's affecting Brussels. And they don't have hurricanes, but they have high wind events and high water events, and they're getting battered. So this is happening. We've got a tremendous amount of resiliency work already underway, almost $600 million in construction work, 5 more worth $75 million in procurement, and just over $4 billion in design alone. And these are with funds, resiliency funds coming from the Federal Transit Administration. The progress report to date, this lists in just gross numbers all the things that have been done. Our employees have worked tirelessly. They are the true heroes in this effort. In the case of after the storm, they worked double shifts. We kept them, we slept them so they could come back, and they were the true heroes. They put the responsibilities of their job, in some cases, before the responsibilities to their families, and I commend them for that. What we need to do going forward, as everyone has said, is spend our dollars wisely. To spend money after a disaster occurs and restore something is fine, but we need to do so in a way in which that dollar spent avoids another dollar being spent should another storm come our way. So in terms of the resilient systems and processes, we need to exclude water from the system, and then when it does enter, we need to find ways to get rid of it as fast as possible. I'm going to show those of you that go on a tour, this is a typical station entrance. We call that a K-railing. That's going down to the Whitehall Street station right down here. And that's a typical opening that we had to protect, and we did it with plywood and sandbags. And it worked fairly well because we didn't get more flooding. However, it's not good enough for the future. What the chart shows is the surge and how it builds. And what you need to do is be able to cut off that peak. You need to, for a period of about an hour and a half to 2 hours, withstand those surges that will be in excess of 12 feet. If you do that, you stand a very high chance of not having any major elements of the system flood, and that's what we need to do. This particular entrance is where a breach occurred and construction timber came down onto the South Ferry Station mezzanine level, big construction timber boards, 24, 2x12s, 24 feet long, bundled together in 20 of them, so it was very heavy. 27 million gallons of water entered the Montague Street tube. When you do the engineering fluid dynamic calculations, it takes 30 minutes for that to happen. So in 30 minutes, we lost the longest underriver tube in the system. What we've done since recovery started and restoring elements of the system, on a parallel track, we wanted to find out what other systems were doing worldwide and how they were dealing with that. There are other similar systems to us in Europe and in Asia, and they have to deal with storm events. When you break apart the system in terms of the categories of what we have to protect, you've got stations and bus depots, the underriver tubes, the facilities where you store and maintain equipment, and all the critical infrastructure elements along the right-of-way that must be protected, and that is by far the biggest challenge we have. One of the things we did find out, New York is unique. We're 24/7, most systems aren't. We're a very flexible system, most systems aren't. They have discrete lines. But the high level of cut and cover construction and the shallowness of the subway to the surface and the large number of subway gratings, which help with ventilation, but they are locations for water can enter. No other system has the number of grates that we have, and no other system has the exposure we have in Lower Manhattan that the MTA has. And when you couple that with the fact that many other places in the world, they have means and mechanisms available to them to control the amount of tidal surge, tidal and storm surge that occurs, those are things we have to design to. These are some examples of flood mitigation standards other systems in the world are using. We are going to move to a 1 in 500 year standard for those elements of the system that have the most highly likely exposure to water events. That would be a prudent expenditure and would significantly reduce the likelihood of occurrence of another Sandy and the impact on the system. Different technologies under considerations are ones that are being used already, as well as ones that are being looked at from a research and development standpoint. And we want to be able to cherry pick from those that have had successful use in other places and adapt them for use here at the MTA. These are some examples of ones for illustrative purposes. The slate and frame is in the lower right-hand corner, and that's where you put planks in to quickly put in a dam-type exposure. The step-up, step-down is what we have right now. If you notice, many places where you enter the subway system, you step up 1 or 2 steps and then go down, primarily for water main breaks, not necessarily for storm surges. But then the other two, which are basically a total enclosure, that's the upper right-hand corner, and a vault-type door, and that's the lower left-hand corner. And depending upon the particular set of infrastructure elements we have, we could use one or a number of these. Same thing with floodgates and flood walls. We may need to put flood walls in and around storage yards and protect equipment. We were able to locate equipment away from a number of places like 148th Street and Lenox along the Harlem River, as well as Coney Island, but in some cases we may need to do more in terms of flood walls. Same thing with fillable bladders that could either be filled with water or air, but most likely water, to be able to provide a dam-like protection and keep water from entering the system. This is a quote that was given by the governor 2 weeks after last year's hurricane. He also made a quote about the fact one can argue whether or not global warming is occurring, but one cannot argue about whether or not the intensity and frequency of storms of this nature are occurring. That's something that we must deal with. And I'll go back to my earlier comment. For a set of infrastructure elements that are worth over $1 trillion and so vital to New York City and the New York economy and the country, 14% of the gross domestic product comes out of the New York area. It's essential that the stewards of the assets that we have responsibility for, we're taking the right actions to make them more resilient. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom, and also thank the men and women of the MTA. It's great work. Now please introduce the Executive Director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, Pat Foye.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Secretary. Superstorm Sandy brought the Port Authority's regional transportation network, airports, ports, trans-Hudson bridges and tunnels, the path system between New York and New Jersey, to a literal halt. A year ago, we all experienced and lived through the greatest public transportation disaster in the nation's history. Under the governor's leadership, our goal has been to build quicker, stronger, and smarter. At the World Trade Center construction site, which some of us will visit today, 2 blocks north of here, 125 million gallons of water from the Hudson and East Rivers poured in. At LaGuardia Airport, the airfield was inundated with over 100 million gallons from Flushing Bay. And at the Holland Tunnel, not far from here, 20 million gallons flooded the tubes. At the airports, hundreds of thousands of passengers suffered canceled flights, and thousands were stranded at our airports. And our path transit system, like the MTA and other transit agencies throughout the region, was particularly hard hit with an estimated 2 million passengers impacted. Overall, we currently estimate the cost of the loss, repair, and recovery to the Port Authority at over $2 billion. And that excludes potentially billions more in resiliency investment. While insurance will cover some of this damage, aid from the federal government has and will continue to be crucial to our recovery. And that includes particularly aid from US DOT, the Federal Transit Administration, and HUD. Today, I'll talk briefly about the remarkable progress the agency has already made in the immediate comeback under Governor Cuomo's leadership. But we all have to recognize that much work remains in the months and years ahead. Let's talk briefly about immediate recovery efforts. First, about 30,000 man-hours were spent at the Port Authority's Emergency Operations Center. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, as Governor Cuomo directed, we focused on restoring service to our customers as quickly as possible. At LaGuardia and JFK airports, we pumped out over 100 million gallons of storm waters and removed literally tons of debris from the airfield so that flights could resume within 2 days at JFK and 3 at LaGuardia. Thanks to a massive pumping operation at the World Trade Center, over 125 million gallons of water were removed, and incredibly, construction activities resumed within 6 days. Restoration of power was critical to reopening our facilities. And again, thanks to the effort led and coordinated by the governor's office, we assembled a small army of generators and oceans of fuel as we worked with our utility providers on restoration of commercial power. On Staten Island, we worked to restore efforts at New York Container Terminal, the largest private sector employer on Staten Island, as quickly as possible. 6,500 cubic yards of debris was cleared so that New York Container Terminal could reopen its gates by Monday, November 5th, just 3 days after the Coast Guard reopened the harbor. New York Container Terminal received its first scheduled ship call the next day. This calendar outlines the Port Authority's Superstorm Sandy timeline response, and we're proud of the work of the 7,000 men and women of the Port Authority in making this recovery possible. Remarkably, our bridges withstood most of the effects of the storm and were opened on Tuesday, October 30th, the day after the storm. At the Holland Tunnel, as I mentioned, our tubes were flooded with an estimated 20 million gallons of storm surge waters. Restoration of power for critical ventilation and other life safety systems was a challenge. Nevertheless, by Friday, November 2nd, we reopened the Holland to bus traffic and reopened the tunnel fully by Wednesday, November 7th. These are pictures of impact and recovery at LaGuardia. You can see the runways are flooded. A critical navigational pier was damaged and has been restored. Additional pictures at LaGuardia where the storm surge reached 12 feet and the airfield was literally swallowed by Flushing Bay. Moving now to JFK. The debris included, extraordinarily, a boat on the runway. A flooded cut-and-cover roadway at JFK was inundated with water, and the JFK bulk fuel farm was also flooded. More pictures of JFK. Clockwise from the left, the flooded 4L runway, JFK 4R runway pier, and debris being removed by JFK aviation staff from the runway. All told, at the New York airports, more than 10,000 flights were canceled and nearly 1 million passengers affected. More pictures here to the top, the LaGuardia Central Terminal building, which you can see the runway and the terminal areas are underwater, and a flooded JFK AirTrain station at Howard Beach. At the World Trade Center site, the flooding was tremendous, causing hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. Mechanical and electrical equipment was destroyed and had to be replaced. Here you can see before and after pictures of some critical below-grade spaces, including the PATH station platforms and equipment areas. Picture at the top is the governor a day or two after touring the World Trade Center site, although the governor was on site the night of the storm. The Vehicle Security Center on the southern end of the World Trade Center site was an open construction pit on the night that Sandy hit. As the governor knows from his inspection that night, the sound of 125 million gallons of water rushing into the site from the Vehicle Security Center was an awful sound. Thanks to an enormous effort to dewater the site quickly, construction resumed as announced by the governor within 60 days. Today, as you'll see on the tour in a little bit, 98% of the concrete structure of the VSC has now been put in place, which on its own significantly reduces the vulnerability of the World Trade Center site to future flooding. Our team is also raising the level of waterproofing, raising key electrical and mechanical equipment, identifying and sealing key points where water can enter. Pumps, generators, and drainage systems have been strategically placed around the site, along with HESCO barriers and other priority protective measures. Since Sandy, under Governor Cuomo's direction, we have been focused on expediting recovery work and cutting red tape where we can. I have exercised all emergency authorities available to me under the Port Authority's bylaws at the governor's direction, and the Port Authority Board has swiftly approved multiple authorizations to keep the recovery work going. Talk for a second about priority protective measures for the current hurricane season. One of our main priorities has been ensuring we are ready, and we are ready for the current hurricane season. We've installed extensive priority protective measures, including significantly enhanced generator capacity, significant increase in available pumps, and flood protection barriers. In total, we have installed nearly 16,000 linear feet, or over 3 miles of barriers, logs, and blocks to protect against flooding at vulnerable entrances and openings. We've also more than doubled the amount of generator capacity we have on hand at agency facilities. While short-term repairs and protective measures are being completed, longer-term repairs are ongoing. We are addressing the pervasive latent impact of saltwater damage on all our equipment and facilities, especially at PATH and the World Trade Center. As I mentioned before, we estimate that total damage to the agency facilities runs over $2.2 billion. We've spent nearly $400 million to date. In terms of funding, our federal partners, including FTA, USDOT, FEMA, and HUD, are playing critical roles. It's a long road ahead, but thanks to Governor Cuomo's leadership, we're building stronger, smarter, and quicker. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Pat. Great job. Our final presenter is our State DEC Commissioner, Joe Martens.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. As you can imagine, and I know most of you are very familiar with the environmental damage which was caused by Hurricane Sandy. We had many, many challenges, needless to say, but we've made enormous progress thanks to the governor's leadership. First of all, you're all aware that the barrier island from the Rockaways to Montauk Point is a largely natural protective feature that runs about 80 miles or so and protects the mainland of Long Island. We have 21 coastal protection projects underway with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we've committed a total of $1.5 billion to those projects. Immediately after the storm, there was 2 breaches, one at Cupsog County Park and one at Smith Point County Park, that within a matter of weeks, we were able to get a contract with the Army Corps of Engineers and close very promptly, because those openings create basically seams or openings in the seam that are protecting the Long Island coast. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, petroleum spills were a huge problem. People's oil tanks lifted up under the floodwaters, turned over, and we literally were faced with millions of gallons of oil in people's basements. DEC and its emergency response teams went out and pumped out 1 million gallons of oil and oily water collected from residences and businesses. That was a critical part of the recovery process because the utilities would not turn power back on to many of these businesses and homes until that oil was removed for obvious reasons. We also had a mountain of solid waste to deal with in the aftermath of the storm. 400,000 tons of solid waste, 2 million cubic yards of vegetative debris, mostly trees, and 71,000 containers of household hazardous waste. We worked closely with the Army Corps of Engineers, with EPA and DEC and other state agencies to basically temporarily permit storage structures and facilities for that waste and then get it moved out of the area safely. We also recycled as much of that material as possible, working closely with EPA. We also immediately, one of the biggest factors were there were several bridges in both Nassau and Suffolk County that needed to be strengthened, and we've already committed projects, and the governor announced just a week or so ago, about 8 bridges that we are going to be strengthening to make sure that the transportation infrastructure on Long Island is upgraded. I think someone already mentioned the effort at state parks, and to my right is Commissioner Harvey. There was more than $120 million worth of damage to 50 state parks in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. Remarkably, all those parks were open by Memorial Day. At Jones Beach, 1.5 miles of the Jones Beach boardwalk was repaired with more resilient materials. At Robert Moses State Park, nearly 3/4 of a million cubic yards of sand were put back on the beach, and the boardwalk there was replaced also with more resilient materials. The Long Beach Boardwalk, 2.2 miles, was fully repaired and reopened just last week. Ocean Parkway and Robert Moses Traffic Circle both received considerable damage. Parts of the parkway were closed. State Parks, working with state DOT, quickly executed a contract and began work and repaired both Ocean Parkway, and as I said, Robert Moses was open for business on Memorial Day. Orient Beach State Park was also rebuilt under a $1.9 million contract with DOT. Roberto Clemente State Park is we're repairing there a bulkhead, which is in danger of basically falling down in the aftermath of the storm, and it is going to be rebuilt using natural infrastructure. Harriman State Park, several dams in that park are also going to be upgraded to gauge against future threats. Wastewater treatment plants. This was a huge challenge in the aftermath of Sandy. 12 million New Yorkers were served by wastewater treatment systems that were affected by Superstorm Sandy. 16 treatment plants were damaged. New York and the federal government has committed over $1 billion to upgrading wastewater treatment plants to protect them and make them more resilient against future storms. The Bay Park plant in Nassau County was extensively damaged. As many of you probably read, 9 feet of standing water was in that treatment plant in the aftermath of the storm. And as Tom and others have mentioned, salt water does not do well with electrical components. So that project will both involve flood walls around the sewage treatment plant as well as raising the level of the electrical infrastructure to keep it out of future stormwater. Bergen Point is another plant that was extensively damaged by the storm, and the commitment there is $242 million. On the energy side, the governor mentioned many of these initiatives during his remarks. As he noted, the Public Service Commission did not have the ability to take direct action when the utilities did not respond quickly enough in the aftermath of the storm. The governor proposed in his executive budget last year, and the legislature agreed to give the PSC some real teeth to require utilities to produce annual plans for response to storms, and if they do not act in accordance with those plans, PSC was given the tools and penalty provisions in the law so that they could actually bring action against the utilities and compel them to comply with those plans. LIPA, as the governor noted, has been replaced by PSE&G Long Island, which is will be a significant improvement in operations there on Long Island. Elevating 32 vulnerable Long Island substations. I believe part of the tour will see some of those substations later today. Clearly, raising them up out of potential flood waters was absolutely critical to keep the electric grid system in operation. The first ever state-level strategic fuel reserve, 3 million gallons will be held in reserve on Long Island so that gasoline will be available in the aftermath of any future storms. And the governor also mentioned that the gas stations on Long Island were a significant problem in the aftermath of the storm. Literally, the stations had gasoline in their tanks, but they couldn't produce it because the power was out. So thanks to this initiative, we will have backup power on all evacuation routes and within a certain distance of all state highways on the island. A number of projects are underway, both on the island and in the city, hardening critical sections of circuits, installing new advanced equipment to isolate distribution system damage and reduce customer outages in future storms, hardening of transmission lines, and a new outage management system. This is a significant upgrade to the system on Long Island, which was seriously out of date. And the new system, the new outage management system, will be a significant improvement. And the governor announced a week or so ago a $20 million challenge to install microgrids in communities on Long Island. 2 communities will be awarded up to $20 million, $10 million each, to do microgrids. This is to encourage communities to establish systems that would be basically a backup if the major utility system goes down and power is not available in those communities. The microgrid would give them the ability to get back up and running much more quickly. This is, I know the governor is hoping this initiative will be expanded around the state. Emergency response, again, we launched the first ever comprehensive emergency management certification and training program. And thanks to an effort at the Department of Health, we've created the New York State e-Fines, a strategic emergency tracking system to ensure that the safety of patients and residents when healthcare and human services facilities have to be evacuated. We've also established 9 regional stockpiles with critical equipment and life-saving supplies for rapid deployment. Things like backup generators, water supplies, food supplies are now strategically located around the state. And also, and finally, a new flood warning system along upstate streams and rivers at risk of flooding. This is obviously critical. The early warning systems were simply not in place for prior storms, and that includes Sandy, Irene, and Lee. This will give communities advance notice when floods are approaching, and hopefully forewarned will be forearmed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. We'd like to open up the floor now to the cabinet for any questions.
Okay.
Seeing none. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank you all for taking time out. I want to thank our special guests for making a trip. And now we're going to start our tour. That concludes our program.